The topic of this video examines really how the interpretation of whose actions the Bill of Rights sort of like governs has changed throughout our country's history, right? So we've already looked at what civil liberties are. They're like really the basic freedoms you possess and really protections against like an abusive government, right? There are a bunch of different sources of your civil liberties, but like the Bill of Rights really is the primary source of your civil liberties. So like the listing of the fundamental freedoms that you possess as an American citizen. So the key question that this like video really focus on is: does the Bill of Rights apply to both the national and state governments? Right? Do like the national government have to promise all these, and state governments have to promise all of these rights to its citizens? So the interpretation on how you answer that question really changes depending on what time period you're looking at in American history. The original interpretation that lasted from like the beginning of our country's history up through like the conclusion of the Civil War was that the state governments didn't have to follow the Bill of Rights. That the Bill of Rights was intended to protect against an abusive national government, but wasn't really applied to the state governments, right? Um, and there's a couple of different reasons for this. Like the first is just the way in which the amendments are written themselves. Like the First Amendment, for example, like reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion." It doesn't say Congress and the state governments. It just says Congress. So the implication is that really it was only meant to protect against the actions of an abusive national government, not necessarily the actions of the state government. And then in 1833, the Supreme Court actually weighs in. I mean, John Marshall is still the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1833, and his court made a decision in a case called Barron v. Baltimore. Now, you don't really know any of the particulars about Barron v. Baltimore, other than the fact that, like, Marshall's court essentially says, like, what we've already talked about. That, yeah, like, the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the actions of the state government. So, like, that's kind of where it lies until, like, 1868. The court's opinion on whether or not the state governments had to follow the Bill of Rights or if it applied to them changes with the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868. No mistake about it, the 14th Amendment is one of the most important, influential amendments in our country's history, if not the most important. So many things are tied to it. We've already talked about the fact that the 14th Amendment is like the second of the three Civil War era amendments. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. 14th Amendment basically establishes citizenship for former slaves. And the 15th Amendment, which will come a couple years later, basically says that voting rights can't be denied because of somebody's race. We've already talked about the 14th Amendment a little bit this year in the fact that when we looked at other court cases, we focused on this last little part of the 14th Amendment, which says you can't deny people equal protection of the laws. That's known as the Equal Protection Clause. And that's really the fundamental basis for lawsuits that people file alleging discrimination, that they're not being treated equally. They're not being guaranteed equal protection under the laws. And then again, it gives citizenship to former slaves. But for like this video, the most important part is another aspect of the 14th Amendment, which is right after the dots here. It says, "Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property." It specifically says that states can't deny people their liberty. So basically, from the ratification of this wording of this amendment, um, the courts begin to change the way they look and apply the Bill of Rights. Because it says states can't deny liberties, right? Now all of a sudden, the court's like, okay, now it does govern the actions of the state governments. And the clause is referred to as the due process clause because you see it says due process of law. And what that does is it incorporates the Bill of Rights. This is the fancy AP government related term that essentially just means making the state governments have to follow those rules and protect those freedoms of its citizens, just like the federal government had always had to. So incorporates just means the states now have to also guarantee its citizens or their citizens those freedoms. Um, However, it's not just like you magically wave a magic wand and the states just automatically have to start protecting all these things. What happens is a process called selective incorporation, where one by one citizens or groups have to essentially accuse states of like violating a particular right found within the Bill of Rights. And then if the court rules in favor of that group, essentially then that freedom is incorporated, and other states would have to also now abide by that in the future. So again, it's been this like steady march through American history of citizens or groups alleging that the state governments now are violating their rights, the Supreme Court hearing the case, and then if determining yes, um, that amendment then becomes incorporated. And you can see like it lists the name of the case, the year that the case was brought to the Supreme Court, and then ultimately how that decision like incorporated what amendment, and then even specifically like what part of that amendment. It's not even enough just to incorporate like the entire amendment. The case would only, if the amendment has multiple parts to it, you would have to hear multiple cases that would incorporate each part of that amendment, and thereby from that point forward, forcing the state governments to provide those like protections for those freedoms. And you can see like all the way down to 2010, where it's not until 2010 that the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, is fully incorporated, meaning the McDonald v. Chicago case requires states not to take away a citizen's right to bear arms, right? So that's fairly recent in American history. So again, just in summary, the original interpretation of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights was that only the national government really had to follow those guidelines. But because of the 14th Amendment's due process clause, and in the process of selective incorporation, we've now begun to make the state governments follow each sort of like little bit and piece of the Bill of Rights as well.